This podcast is sponsored by PAX. Whether on water, on land or in the air, PAX bags are both versatile and flexible backpacks that are perfectly suitable for your requirements in the most demanding of environments. PAX bags are highly regarded due to their exceptional performance in pre-hospital and in critical care environments. Renowned for their durability, they endure harsh conditions while providing rapid and reliable access to essential kit. So their well-organised compartments and customisable configurations enhance efficiency in high-stress situations. PAX bags are designed with infection control in mind and are easy to clean and disinfect. Their highly visible colours and reflective strips add quick identification and adherence to quality standards, assuring reliability. The versatility of PAX bags caters to a diverse EMS providers, but also delivers vital equipment and durability and ease of use for pre-hospital critical care services globally. I've used PAX bags in a number of critical care situations and they're absolutely excellent. Please see the show notes for further details. This podcast is sponsored by Well Medical. Well Medical specialise in life-saving defibrillators and emergency medical equipment. Trusted by healthcare professionals and first responders across the UK, they're committed to making high-quality, reliable medical tools more accessible. In a world where every second counts, Well Medical provide cutting-edge defibrillators designed to be easy to use even for non-professionals. Their products help improve survival rates in cardiac emergencies, making them an essential tool in schools, offices, gyms and public spaces. Their most popular model, the iPad SP1, offers voice prompts and simple visual aids, ensuring anyone can confidently administer help. Beyond defibrillators, Well Medical offer a range of first aid supplies, making them a one-stop shop for emergency preparedness. They also provide training and support, ensuring individuals and organisations know how to use the equipment when it matters the most. Well Medical doesn't just sell products, they're passionate about saving lives, so their dedicated customer services and comprehensive support ensures peace of mind for everyone who invests in their life-saving technology. So visit Well Medical today to learn how you can make your space safer for everyone. You can also visit the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be speaking with Chris Denny around selecting for high performers. So what I want to do in the conversation is really explore the critical topic of selecting pre-hospital clinicians for high-stakes environments. So we're going to explore the traditional methods of using clinical selection and why they might fall short in the unpredictable world of pre-hospital care. So we're going to discuss the need to redefine performance criteria to better suit high-pressure situations and indeed identify which mental and physical attributes are key indicators of reliable performance in challenging situations. So we're going to touch on the role of personality inventories and whether they are more or less advantageous to choose clinicians with diverse personalities or indeed specific traits. So we'll also look at effective teamwork as an essential prerequisite in pre-hospital care, and indeed how to assess a clinician's potential for collaboration and whether prioritising leadership or followership or a balance of both yields better results. So to do this, I have Chris Denny with me. Chris is an emergency medical specialist at Auckland City Hospital. Additionally, he holds key roles as the medical director of Northern Rescue, so that's Auckland's Rescue Helicopter Trust. He's also a member of New Zealand's medical assistance team, so that's a WHO emergency medical team. So Chris has expertise spanning acute care, leadership and education, and has been helping to advance both emergency medicine and pre-hospital and retrieval medicine in New Zealand. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, well, thank you very much for having me.
Chris, I was wondering if we could just kick off by just asking a fundamental question around the traditional methods used to select pre-hospital clinicians. Could you maybe speak to why they might be insufficient?
What we're doing currently in New Zealand, I think, would be seen still as pretty traditional, and the teams we have are good. So I just want to make the point that I think that the people we've selected, in my mind, are of high value. And so one could ask the question, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? But I've had experience both, I suppose, trying to be selected and often not, but also now with the responsibility for selection. And so I'll maybe describe what we currently do and where we think we can improve. I guess if you were to apply to our service in New Zealand, you would submit an online application. It would have hopefully a cover letter, maybe a CV, and some references. People would be willing to sort of vouch for your character. You then, based on that paper-based assessment, would be selected for shortlisted for an interview. That interview be either in person or potentially virtual, depending on where you are in the world. And on the basis of that, which is a panel single interview, you might then extend into reference checks, which are a mixture of kind of written and verbal. And I think what we found is that we're pretty fortunate with the candidates that we have, is that we have, great people to select from. But there is an element of what we call paper and a bit of pageant and a bit of polish. And it's sometimes hard to know quite what we're selecting for. And so I'll maybe pause and check. What's your experience, Owen? And is that a similar model where you're working, or how do you find it?
No, it is absolutely. I think, like you said, reference checks, and then just a pre-screen just to make sure that the selection criteria is fulfilled, and then an assessment day, and then looking, and we'll get into this within the conversation around assessment of competence within that selection day and how we both define competence and indeed right whether we're testing for the right attributes within competence, and we'll also dig into, I think what I'm really interested in, Chris, is like I said, the interplay between technical and non-technical competence, because they're not the same, it's important to have both facets in that assessment.
For us, we're also trying, and keep in mind, we're not selecting for inert objects, but we talk about how do you select for the race car of the future. And I was going to give you an example of that because this is what sort of stimulated our thinking. Traditionally, if you think about the America's Cup, which, for example, is underway right now in Spain, and the New Zealanders do well, by the way. And as much as my accent is Canadian, we've lived in New Zealand for over a decade and feel quite strongly a sense of kinship with our fellow New Zealanders. But the idea of a sailor would be a grinder, somebody usually with quite a lot of experience. And so their upper arms would lead with strength, and that burliness would help to trim sails. But I think the New Zealanders fairly asked the question, but how can we push that performance a little bit harder? And so a couple of cups ago, you may recall a strange person came to be, which was actually cyclor. So this kind of hybrid cyclist and sailor. And if you look at who's actually now sailing for Team New Zealand in Barcelona, many of them are Olympic caliber athletes, multi-sport athletes, mountain bike athletes, former special forces, but actually with almost no sailing experience. And so I think that's what got us thinking, gosh, if we're trying to improve, what does that look like? And so then, and I'll give you a couple of examples around the astronaut corps and what that meant. But for them, that idea of going up in the Mercury rocket to come around the Earth or maybe go suborbital and come back down, their selection was quite specific. And now if you think about the Artemis program and how long duration space flight and having to work often for quite great distances and times, whether we go to Mars or not, that's informed how they're selecting. And for our own service, I guess the most poignant piece was our origin is very much in the sea. And so, it's the Auckland Rescue Helicopter and came deliberately out of a close kinship with surf lifesaving. But increasingly now, the government, the people would expect more from us in terms of not just rescue proficiency, but also a pre-hospital care standard that we can bring, and increasingly an inter-hospital, or if you prefer, a retrieval. And I think that's what got us thinking, gosh, can these same traditional methods apply?
And that absolutely makes sense, actually. I think it's always good to really inspect and review selection criteria, but also just as a part of quality assurance for selection. And that brings me nicely on to the next question, which is really how we can redefine performance criteria for high stakes environments. And I guess the segue into that question might be, Chris, would you advocate sort of almost creating the conditions, this high fidelity assessment criteria where you are putting actors in, you are putting what we call injects into the scene, and almost creating a high fidelity scenario to test competence, both technical and non-technical?
It's a fair question. I'm going to try and get a working definition of performance we can agree upon. So if we agree, we talk about performance being your capability plus the behavior. And I think that gets to what you were just discussing. How we get there, it's really easy if there's somebody you've worked with or there's someone who's giving you I guess, a chance through whether it's word of mouth or other pieces to say, well, I know how Owen performs. I've flown with Owen. Like, what does that mean? But that actually really, that quite dramatically limits the pool of potential applicants. And so how we assess them, and this, although as a medical director, we select both doctors and paramedics, our selection processes are different, and we can talk about that. And I think we're learning from one another. But the idea of a single high stakes assessment actually doesn't have a ton of validity. And that's one of the challenges we face is, do we want someone who's already good at the job and maybe optimized, or are we looking for someone who, again, comes back to that concept of the cyclor, who may have all sorts of attributes which our organization could benefit from, but actually in the current state may not have the polish of, a paramedic doctor team and a concept of scene management and kit dumps and interacting with hospitals and other pieces. So we do struggle with, if we were to have high stakes assessment, what would that look like? And could we validate that model? I think the other part is, how do we, even before we start selecting, how do we recruit? And I would say that we try, and we're a charity, so we have modest means, but we really try and think about early identification of talent. And this is something that many other industries have taught us, but waiting for people to come and knock on our door is fantastic. And we found some superb people, but ideally we want to get upstream. And so we're working with the sort of paramedic universities, the medical schools, trying to understand, where might people who are curious about what we do learn more, and how can we then focus them in? So I suppose I do want to bring that point around performance, because is the traditional model sufficient? And some might say it is, but I do wonder whether, if we're really trying to optimize, and we should talk about the difference between peak and optimal performance, what are we selecting for? And do we want people that look exactly like you or I, or do we want something different?
Absolutely. And I think we'll go there shortly around peak and optimal performance, because I'd like to look at analogs actually, Chris. And just something you said there before we do, I'll just double click on that, is around this sense of curiosity. And I think to your point around attending governance days or uh, events which maybe the air ambulance is putting on, starting to self-select almost, because you're putting yourself in the environment, you're starting to understand the attributes, key attributes that people in the environment and work in the environment model and embody, that of cool, calmed sort of approach, or indeed just their, sharing the mental model or the soft non-technical skills, together with some of the more fundamental attributes of technical skills, but starting to almost, and this is a really interesting concept, maybe I'll just throw the ball to you on this one, which is just this element of self-selection. Because when I was selected for London HEMS, I actually went through the physician response unit, which is the more low acuity primary care work, and then but attending governance days, starting to attend extracurricular education events of my own time, free of, not no overtime, and consistently putting myself in an environment around these kind of people. What's your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think first, credit to you, and I would say also credit to London's Air Ambulance. If I look at global leaders in terms of not just, if you will, optimizing performance, but also building that culture, I think just to hold them up as an example of what's possible. And as I understand it, their clinical governance day, for example, as long as you have, your government ID or your health service ID, it's actually quite an open forum where people can come and get a sense of it. And it was something I was going to talk about later, but I think it's important that we don't see selection as you selecting me. Like, it shouldn't be unidirectional. And I think part of this has to be a sense of, do our values align? By that, I mean, is the growth and development, the phase of the service actually commensurate with what you as an individual are seeking? And do we fit? And they talk about that quite a lot with leaders. And, is the style of leadership you might bring appropriate for what the service needs? But I think similarly for candidates, it's quite important, do they favor a certain case mix? Do they is there a desire to be part of a transport platform? They want an academic piece. And so I think, as you say, you can't get that across in just the sort of the stiffness of an interview. I think some of that requires some pre-work by both sides.
No, absolutely, absolutely, Chris. Just moving forward and looking at, you've already notioned towards elite athletes and some of the attributes that elite athletes embody and sort of reflect to the rest of their teammates. And one of the really interesting, and my question is really how we learn from the selection process for other high performing groups such as astronauts and athletes. And just as an adjoining to that, and just something I'd like your perspective on is a relationship to failure, because one of the key attributes we started to look at within selection models within the UK was putting people into forced failure, where there was just really no way they could pass something, and then actually giving them quite a simple task on the back end of it. Might be just ventilating a patient, might be doing something quite easy or relatively easy, and can they move past the failure to still operate? Because again, that's such a common analog of reality, attributes of you can't win in this situation, but can you still
Mm.
perform afterwards? Could I get you to speak to that?
Sure. And I should just for disclosure, I'm not an elite athlete. My background was ice hockey and then rowing, but I could give you, I suppose, a rowing example. And again, the New Zealanders, although Great Britain have both performed really well in the most recent, the Paris Olympics, I think there's an objectivity to a sport such as rowing, which is hard for me to extrapolate into the work that we do. And so, your erg score is on a device which is calibrated, the distance is set. I think that it's quite easy to make a comparison, and whether that performance, some people say ergs don't float, but that idea, which is you can objectively measure the power that you might generate, that is powerful. But what I think is interesting is, at least when I was rowing, and I think this is still the case, you're forever being selected. And I think that's really interesting, in some ways quite different from what we would experience within our aeromedical services. So this idea of, switching seats just to see whether you're going to actually get the boat to move faster than I will, we don't do that with our crews. And I'm not actually convinced that we should. The example I was going to give you, and this is, I guess, my own personal experience, was back in 2009. I applied along with 5,000 other people to be an astronaut, and this was through the Canadian Space Agency. It was their astronaut recruitment campaign. But the odds were stacked against, I guess, pretty much everyone, right? 5,000 people, two spots. So what I would say is, and this is important to us as we develop our own selection process, whether you're successful or not, I think the process has to be fair. That's probably without being said, but also has to be informative and hopefully educational for the candidates. And so, I was unsuccessful, but as we move through it, the deliberate example that sort of got me thinking is what they would call a damage control scenario. And so I'll paint a picture. This is open source, so you can see this if you go to the Canadian Space Agency's website. But it's in small groups, and these are teams you've never met, and quite deliberately cross pollinated. So military and civilian, engineers, scientists, doctors, pilots. But the concept comes quite literally from Navy ships, and how does one perform a damage control operation? And so as the water starts to leak in, you're given quite basic tools, just wedges and rags and sort of hose pipes and ways. But as the water starts to get up, what's interesting is the pressure does start to mount, and you start to get cold, and people start to get cross, and tools get dropped in the water, and you've lost the tools. And then as the sort of light starts to dim, a bit of fear kicks in as well. And then, of course, the smoke comes in, and there's all the disorientation. But I think, to your point, I don't think anyone's being selected for their ability to perform damage control on a ship. Instead, in some ways, and this is me speculating, but it was more to understand, how do these individuals perform under pressure? Do they embrace the pressure? How do they manage that struggle? How do they help others in the struggle? And in the end, when sort of the water's up to your neck, and obviously the ship's sinking, what do you do then? And you're on to the next exercise. So how do you reset and move forward? And I think what's challenging is, firstly, most services don't have the means or the time to allow for that kind of assessment. But the idea, which is, we're not looking at your ability to swing a mallet. What we want to understand is, how do you manage under that pressure? Can you optimize your performance under that pressure? And that, I think, is actually something we should consider. And we haven't done that successfully yet.
Brings me quite nicely on to, Chris, just looking at which mental and physical attributes that you would perceive to be most predictive of reliable performance in austere environments.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, and I tried to do a bit of research. I gave a talk on this earlier in the year in Scotland at the Retrieval Conference. But what I'd say is, I don't know that for pre-hospital and retrieval medicine, these attributes have been clearly defined. There's a gentleman named Jay Hennessy from the US Navy, and he talks about character and competence. And I think most people nod when we talk about those two things, but how we measure them is actually not simple. The All Blacks famously said, they have a no dickheads policy, which, again, if you can kind of work through the technical language, is an interesting comment again on what are some of the core, I suppose, values or attributes that we would select for. And then I've been interested in a book by a guy named Rich Deviney, who's again from the US Navy, and he talks about attributes, and I think he has 5, and I wrote them down. So he talks about grit, which we would translate to sort of fire in the belly, or I suppose passion. There's mental acuity, which we would translate as kind of learning agility. And then there's drive, or some people call motivation. There's a bit around leadership itself. And then there's something around team ability. which is something we were just kind of talking about. So how do you interact with others and form up? So I think those are the attributes that he would acknowledge, obviously coming from a military perspective for high performing teams. But I think that those have some relevance for the work we're doing. And I guess I should say attributes in some ways are not specific examples of knowledge or necessarily a technical skill. They are, I suppose, more how one at a core behaves. And the challenge we're finding is we can say, well, we'd love to see Owen's grit, but how do we measure that? And how can we have any kind of reliability in those measures? And so as much as it's a concept we're curious about, what it seems is that people are now finding a balance between some qualitative assessments of these attributes, if you want, and then using some more quantitative measures. So maybe we can talk more about that.
So let's just look at psychological testing. I am actually really interested in how you measure attributes and objectively, and like you said, there's just the inference of that over time. So you put them into a pool. But let's just pivot because psychological testing or psychometric testing is I wouldn't say necessarily controversial, but a lot of models do have limited applicability. Could I get you to speak to whether it should be part of clinical selection processes, Chris?
Yeah, and this, I think we're on the cusp of doing just a bit of prototyping here for our own service. The caveat I would say is if we separate, you or I deciding early on in our careers that we want to study to be a paramedic or to be a doctor, whatever it is we want to do, at least for our service, we're taking people they're through that professional stage. They've then acquired often a decade or more of experience. They've demonstrated proficiency. In fact, they've demonstrated excellence. And so we're getting people who are, if you will, moving well through their field, whatever their chosen vocation is. But what's interesting, so one of my daughters got into vet school a few years ago, and they used to study, sorry, I beg your pardon, a test called Casper. And Casper is the online, it's got a situational judgment test. And the idea behind it, I'm just going to make sure I get this right, is to look at behavioral tendencies of applicants pursuing people-centered professions. And so we took a look at, can an online situational judgment test be of value or not? And what stage do you look at? And so in the vet school's instance, and for my former medical school, this is part of the initial application. So this is, if you will, a piece of data, which is part of an amalgam that's decided on when are we going to shortlist people then to interview. But I'm intrigued about it because it appears to have quite good performance, I suppose, both reliability and validity. And it's now being used extensively across many of the professional schools. And so what I'm interested in is whether we just start to ask people to do this and then see whether we can correlate our own group's experience with it. But I can't find an example of a service currently using it right now. And I suppose the pushback would be it wasn't developed particularly for the group of candidates that we're seeking to I suppose, evaluate. But I'm intrigued by it, and I love the objectivity which it can be done from anywhere on the planet, and it's, again, scored quite fairly and sent. So I'm curious what your experiences might be.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. We're looking at a number. We have used SDI, so the inventories. We've used Myers-Briggs type indicators, and indeed the Big Five personality. So Ocean, the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, assertiveness, and neuroticism, and looked at and tested for those five different factors in the past in various ways. They're all of them have their flaws. So the SDI is a fantastic tool. Again, there is counter evidence against it, but it does give a feel, and there's a certain element of testing over time. And we have definitely done it under duress to try and pressure test some of the elements. It gives you a conflict sequence as well, which is quite interesting to see how you react and shift under conflict, and in strengths and overdone strengths. So what strengths do you believe you are exhibiting, and indeed what you might be unaware that you are overly so doing?
Selection may not be the right phrase, but within our own teams, and I'll give you the example of my clinical governance team, but we've looked at the very same tool. So the strength development inventory, I think it's version 2.0. But if you imagine this triangle where there's kind of performance, I think there's process, and then there's people. What's interesting is that amongst the three of us, we probably all have a predisposition in a different corner. So I'm probably more performance interested. One of the deputies is very process based, and yet another's quite people based. But to your very point, that's really helpful within our teams to understand that under conflict, I may tend to assert myself. The person who is more process based will tend to analyze, and the person who's more people based may tend to accommodate. And so by knowing that, I think we can be hopefully fair within ourselves. And I'm interested in whether that's actually something that across the organization we need to understand better.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and having, like you said, because you can extrapolate them, put them all on one motivational value system, and so you have everyone on the same triangle, which is, and then where everyone moves to under conflict, which is really interesting, actually. Pivoting just due to time, Chris, and just looking at teamwork, actually, if that's okay for a second, and how we assess potential for effective teamwork in pre-hospital settings. Could you speak to how we assess?
Sure. Um, there's a Colombian named Eduardo Salas who said, I think famously, a team of experts does not make an expert team. And I suppose, why do I say that? It's challenging because we aren't assessing teams. We're looking at a potential candidate and whether she or he will be a good fit for our team. And there's this risk. And so when we're exploring this is whether do we seek more of ourselves? Are we trying to clone whatever is our current state? Or are we deliberately trying to cross-pollinate? Do we want to inject something which is different or novel or fresh? And by that, I just mean whether that's a different gender or a different age bracket or different ethnicity, or is it actually a different background? And so I think that is our challenge, because to define effective teamwork, we struggle quite a lot with this concept of the team of teams. So we fly in a crew of 4, and we have a pilot and an air crew officer. We have 2 critical care paramedics on some missions. We have a pre-hospital retrieval medicine doctor and a critical care paramedic. So how that crew interacts invariably will include, is it a first responder, whether that's Coast Guard, surf life saving, the ambulance service, the fire department, the police department, or it could be a hospital team. So I suppose that's a long way for me of saying, I think it's quite challenging to predict in the traditional interview format how that person may integrate. And some of these more, I suppose, structured assessments, and whether we can find something more objective, or whether this is where we have to really tap into references and, if you will, sub-reference checks. I'm not sure. And I think the other part is, if we get the attributes right, is teamwork something we can train? And that's, I guess, another part of this puzzle is, if someone is, I suppose, she or he was the captain of their ice hockey team, field hockey team, whatever that is, does that demonstrate a commitment to teamwork that we think is translatable? And I'm not sure.
Just looking at leadership and followership for a minute, Chris, in the selection process, in your mind, should we be testing or indeed looking for a balance of both, or should we sort of almost more preferentially be looking for one over the other?
I think I listed in those 5 attributes that Rich Devaney described that both leadership and team ability are core attributes. So that's kind of 40% of the mix. We state explicitly, and we tell our candidates that we are selecting for leaders. But the leadership is probably not the traditional heroic model. In fact, we talk about a model called dynamic subordination, which, without sounding too convoluted or kinky, is this idea of whoever knows what needs to happen next is in charge. And the example I gave you for a pre-hospital mission is that in the early phase of the mission, the pilot's most likely in charge, and she or he will have, obviously they'll be in command of the aircraft, but also probably have the most to offer. Overhead, whether we need to winch insert or what that needs to be, the aircrew officer may start to take that leadership role on. And then once first on scene, the paramedic may be best placed to lead the scene, to provide that scene overview and safety. Once we get into clinical care, and as we start to interface with a hospital, in fact, that leadership mantle may move to the doctor, and she or he may have a role to play. So I suppose, again, is leadership a skill which people bring? We think it is an attribute, but is it something we should develop? We think it is.
So just looking at something you said earlier, Chris, around grit, and grit really being resilience, and just this tendency just to continue despite the odds or despite the dynamic environment. Could I get you to speak to how you test for resilience and indeed evaluate resilience in potential clinicians?
I I don't know that we are measuring resilience at the time of initial intake. So I'll say that again. To me, that's I suppose a gap in the way we approach this. It's become an issue, and I'll give you the example, which is in the hospital. We think that the pressure most people are facing is actually around burnout and the risk of moral injury. And so, how does one conduct themselves in such a climate? And I can't speak for the hospital system where you are, but certainly in the southern hemisphere, we're under quite a lot of pressure in the midst of winter. So, we look to see how people navigate that environment. And for the work we do in the pre-hospital setting, it is more often discrete events. And that whole concept, I suppose, kind of almost operational stress injury, and how does one manage that? And so, what I don't know is whether some hypothetical scenarios might help us to start to understand people's approach to it. We're increasingly of the view that asking someone to have individual resilience is actually unfair. And as though we want people to be, I suppose, full of wellness and by that kind of professional fulfillment for the work they're doing, and we want to provide the tools for them to be strong both physically and mentally. We are thinking harder about not just individual but also team-based resilience and increasingly organizational resilience. And I suppose I see it as a responsibility of our service to put that into place. But some of the things that we will ask, and again, these are open source questions, is how can somebody give us an example of a time when they've had to use their resilience, and what did that look like? We're trying to uncover, I suppose, what are some of the things that help them to recover. So those are the things we're exploring. The other thing we're exploring is how much of their mindset is around, I suppose, growth, and that comes to that concept of grit. But is it possible to measure one's commitment to growth and one's willingness to kind of learn? And I think that's a really interesting area to explore.
No, absolutely, Chris, absolutely, and almost to a point around how people recover or indeed process having to embody resilience and show resilience. Yeah, it's really, you said this just there, is around how individuals reflect and how through debrief, through other people's feedback, really within the team and within that scenario or clinical incident, and trying to get to an honest place of reflection, self-reflection through others' feedback. How good was communication? How good was the closed loop communication? How explicit was the communication? Was the plan verbalized? Was there a plan B, plan
Mm.
C? Did everyone feel empowered? Did everyone feel listened to? And almost trying to tease that out of what could be a very extremely challenging situation, multiple or single patients, but almost holding that mirror up to yourself through debrief and through, again, it's not a self-narrative, and it's not driven. It's letting the team tell the story, both personally but also for their benefit. And I think that could be quite exposing, but also quite revealing, in a good way, to kind of see where the chinks in the armor are, where you can become more resilient or indeed more, I think, consistent over time. But one of the things you were saying about the NASA selection is just
Mm.
embodying consistency irrespective of changing dynamic situations or deteriorating patients or multiple patients. And then, the vicarious stress that you carry over to the next patient or the next patient, can you embody consistency over the duration of 12 hours? Or to your
Mm.
point, 4 shifts, 8 shifts, 12 shifts, and so it is that calm consistency that you almost need to tease out of others, because I think the self narrative we tell ourselves, and I'd be interested to get your perspective on this, Chris, is sometimes I would reflect after an incident, think, yeah, and okay, we might manage to get to the end point or whatever, and then you actually get some feedback from the doctor or from your colleague that I completely missed and that would completely blindsided me, but was extremely valuable because you could start to see elements that your own self-reflection is completely negated.
Yeah, it's a great point. And what we're dealing with right now is how do we, and this is across the service, how can we offer professional development around feedback and assessment? And much as we said, we expect everyone to be a leader, we expect everyone to assess and then also to be able to receive feedback well. And we know the negative feedback kind of gets weighted 3 times as much. And so, to your point, you've got the insight to be able to take that feedback and say, how can I learn from this? But I suppose what we're curious is that trainable, or is that a skill that people bring into the work they're doing? And partly, what's the environment? Can we create that safety from a psychological standpoint so that people are comfortable sharing what they're thinking with one another? And I suppose that's where we'd expect the candidate in some ways to be selecting for us and trying to make their own decision as to, what's the quality of the service I might choose to enter.
So, Chris, just as we come into land, a couple more questions. One would be just looking at the main barriers to effective selection
Hmm.
of pre-hospital clinicians. Could you maybe speak to how they can be overcome?
So, as much as we've talked about astronaut selection and Olympic selections and other sort of teams where we're really trying to pick for the very best, we would still have that same goal. But I think the obvious barriers for us are around time and money, so quite literal resource. And then I think there is a barrier around distance, and I suppose that's linked to time, and that's partly because we're an international service. We draw candidates from nationally, so New Zealand, but internationally as well. And I think the other part is a cultural barrier, which I'm happy to talk about. So, you know, everybody would like more time and more money. So I think it's unfair for me to say that's insurmountable. How we get around that is, I suppose, trying to think about smarter solutions. So we've talked a bit about whether there's online situational judgment tests and other things which may give us the information we want, but without a huge outlay of cost. We're interested in whether is a virtual interview. So here we are having a virtual conversation, but can you gain as much virtually as you can in person? And we hope that the answer is yes, because if not, it's going to be an expensive process to always bring people in. Interestingly, during the astronaut recruitment campaign, whether you worked in the Canadian Space Agency, or you were, offshore or in a field of conflict, everybody's was a virtual interview for the purpose of just standardization. They wanted to give everybody a similar chance. So I think that's interesting. The part around distance we've talked about, but I think using these hybrid solutions is going to be helpful. And that may extend in terms of even assessments. You can imagine that just like one can submit a CrossFit workout and it could be coached by a peer anywhere in the world, you could imagine you could theoretically structure an assessment in such a way. I think the cultural piece is interesting. And I'll just say for our own institutions, the hospitals tend to be quite conservative in their mindset. And I don't speak on behalf of the human resources department, but a willingness to change tact is often met with what's the problem we're trying to solve? And we've always done it this way. And I think, my thought is that if we're going to change things, we probably need to be really upfront with candidates that we're going to try some new measures, but that potentially they won't be weighted in the decisions in the early stages of something like this. I think we have to be willing to learn from stuff as we go and try and find candidates. And we do look for people who are curious as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just looking finally at just a few salient take-home points, Chris, around how we starting to think differently about selecting for high performance teams. I think everything you've mentioned over the past half an hour has been fantastic because, like you said, we can start to focus with a different lens on selection of high performing teams and tease out attributes, but also think differently about reflection, about resilience, about some of these character attributes, and also about consistency, relationship with failure, redefining the endpoints and looking at different competencies that might not be tested for initially. Could you give us some take-home points, Chris, for listeners?
I think the first part is, and I mean this on behalf of the service, not the candidates, but I think that the need to stay curious is quite important. I think that genuine desire, I think we carry as a community, which is to optimize our performance and to do that, not just, for an Olympic year, but to think about what does that mean to reliably, to durably perform. I think, coming to a service with that curiosity is really powerful. And for the service equally to be thinking about how can we select well. I think the other part, which is tied to that, is that feedback loop that you've described beautifully. And it's that whether the candidate's successful or not, I really think it's quite important that the experience was ideally not just informational, but educational. And, I draw upon my own experience where I was a failed astronaut recruit, but that time spent, and in fact, the people I got to know dramatically transformed the way I thought about not just my practice of medicine, but even where I chose to live. So I'd love to think that we can, in some small way, create an impactful experience, whether the candidate is successful or not. I think the final part is that idea of fit. And I think the more I've both tried to be selected for something and or selected others, it's respecting that bidirectional discourse and that idea, which is, as a candidate, I want to be quite curious about your service. And where is it at? Is it a startup? Is it something which is in a growth phase? Is it a mature, high-performing service? Is it a regenerating service? I think those questions actually need to be disclosed in some ways by the service so people understand what they're doing. Then the more granular elements about case mix and transport platform and team composition and other, if you will, qualities of clinical governance need to be disclosed fairly. Just like if you imagine an investor would want to see a statement before they could make a good choice. And I think for us, we're still in a growth and development phase. We are seeking not just leaders in pre-hospital and retrieval medicine, but we're seeking leaders at a national level as we seek to try and improve the quality of care for patients we serve. So we're pretty transparent with people. And what we would say is, for our service, you need to be quite tolerant with uncertainty. We talked a bit about the transformation underway currently in New Zealand, and even just the way, we imagine our service in the future being, the care we provide. So I think that's probably my biggest take home, is that willingness to have not just a straight and what can you offer us, but I think that in how we might be able to offer something to you.
That's fantastic, Chris. What we'll do is put some of the education content you've spoken on this subject in the show notes, so people can just double click on it and indeed learn more about selecting for high performance individuals and teams. It just leaves me to say thank you for the past half an hour. It's been fantastic just to dissect this fascinating topic with you. Thank you, Chris.
Oh, again, my pleasure. What I would say is very much, I see myself in the learning phase around how does one select, and certainly keen to hear from people that work within your community and your audience, either their experiences or how they suggest we might do it better in the future.
That's fantastic. And what we'll do in the show notes as well is I'll put a link indeed to get in touch with indeed yourself through your organization, and indeed people can get in touch that way just to start to, let's say, increase the narrative and the dialogue around how we improve selection for high performing teams.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.